what that event looked like. We now have this data, Erie, Broomfield, Longmont, Boulder, coming together, and we have a year of data in Commerce City where we could say, hey, our problems are bad, but Commerce City was a whole lot worse. So when you really start to like see what's happening at my Suncor, so the more monitors we put in place, the more we can see how the regions are comparing. We can absolutely see they have an I to N pentane ratio that shows when it's an oil and gas source, or a source that's not, it might be more not oil and gas related, something else coming up. That data is what's gotten us so far at the state. So much of the state legislation, so much of the rulemaking that's been done, you'll see this data showing up in these conversations. And what we also know is that technology changes. So if we don't keep monitoring, the industry will say, but yeah, that's from a few years ago, we made technological advances. So this constant, keeping up with the monitoring is so critical. The more of it we have, the more we can advocate. And we're also making progress on getting all this data to be accepted by the state. And we've increased recent legislation that said you have to accept more of this data. Like, we're making progress. The 3 years, I just want to clarify that 3-year pause on legislation was a small group that came together, and probably nothing will get passed, but it doesn't mean people can't try. That's important. And we're still catching up on rulemakings. SB 19181 passed in 2019. We're just getting underway, but the cumulative impact rulemaking piece is starting back up again. A huge effort can be done there. So we've got a lot of work to do over these next few months in this, or a few years in this pause, I guess.
I see a couple of hands up here. Thank you. Thank you. This gentleman first, and then I'll come back to it.
Thank you, and thank you all. Ever since Paul's ill-conceived compromise, a lot of us have been talking about how can we circumvent that ban on new legislation for the next 2.5 years on ozone. And I'm wondering, Andrew talked about how maintenance events currently don't need to be reported. And I wonder if that could be either new legislation or just new rulemaking.
That would help, wouldn't it? It's been something that we have, there's a lot. So the maintenance event sort of non-reporting is one loophole. There's a lot of loopholes. That ends up being a very large portion of the work that I do, is pointing out regulatory loopholes to the regulators, much to their disappointment. And so, it's been a conversation we've had, and I think it's one direction we could take things in. Whether or not it could be at a rulemaking or not, rulemaking spaces, as you all know, can be very frustrating because they're somewhat constrained by the guardrails that are built in place before the rulemaking ever gets underway. So the actual sort of steps forward that you can take in a space like that is kind of dependent on what rule you are considering and how far whatever commission is willing to go. It could be something that you could tackle through legislation. It would be very difficult to get the industry to report something that they've never traditionally had to report, because they're not going to want to do that. So I think, but finding these gaps, as Laurie said. The more that we've monitored, the more that I conduct my on-the-ground observations with the camera, the more that municipalities monitor these emissions and quantify these emissions, the more we are able to both sort of get a sense in the lay of the land of what emissions currently exist. But as Laurie astutely pointed out, things are changing in the oil fields. They are adopting new technology, but they're also adopting new narratives. And oftentimes the narratives are moving a lot quicker than the technology is in regards to how clean and wonderful things are. And so making sure that we're keeping up with these potential shortcomings as they crop up and we can observe them, so that we can do something about them, is really, really important. But I think a first step in regards to tackling this kind of non-reporting issue with maintenance, regardless of, I don't really have a good answer for the kind of best venue for doing that. But we need to know that something like that's occurring. We need to be able to demonstrate that this is a real issue and that these things are occurring. And so, you know, in that example I shared with you, in my ideal universe, there could have been some way to quantify those emissions, to capture it in some other way than just me capturing it with the camera, where I can detect an emission event, but I can't quantify, I can't say how much benzene, you know, that maintenance event dumped into the Greeley community. But having those additional data sources to play off of would be very, very helpful in making these arguments in terms of where these regulatory gaps are having the most harm and where we need to kind of prioritize fixing these gaps.
Thank you. Yeah, the narrative from the oil and gas industry. One of their narratives is that they're beginning to do monitoring, particularly with Project Canary. And so there, certainly one of the things local governments can do is more and better monitoring. And so I'd like it if you explain a little bit about monitoring, what's possible, what's practical. There seems to be a big sort of two-tiered approach to monitoring. There are the canisters, which are very local, and then there's regional monitoring, such as what Boulder Air does. And then both of those, if they're going to really have any effect, have to be in something like real time, so that you know that, you know, if people are getting toxified, you know about it not a month after it happened, but some kind of timeliness where people can do something. But it also has to be at enforcement level quality data. And so can you speak a little bit about the kind of monitoring technologies that you have knowledge of and experience with, and what is worth doing? What gives us information in a time frame that's useful? What gives us information in a data quality that's useful? And Andrew, could you speak a little bit about what Earthworks has done in terms of looking at some of the monitoring that's being done, such as the report that came out, Certified Disaster, which looks at Project Canary canister type monitoring, which missed everything.
I can take part of that. I think, you know, I'd be interested if others have additional thoughts to add on that, the bigger part of your question. And I mentioned this a little bit with the third slide that I had up there, where I mentioned the instance where it was an emission event that I filmed with our camera from a half mile away. There were fence line monitors along the fence line of the facility, but they didn't detect the plume until the wind happened to blow it over one of the monitors. And so it's important to understand that low-cost monitors, so there's going to be costs and benefits to whatever technology you kind of choose to adopt. And so a low-cost monitor has the benefit of being low cost and being relatively agile. You can deploy potentially a lot of them over a large area, but they do have low sensitivity, and they're going to be, whether or not they detect an emission event, it's going to determine, it's entirely going to be determined by whether or not the plume crosses directly over the sensor for the monitor. And these monitors are somewhat blind. They're not looking for plumes. They're just sitting there hoping that, you know, you have it in the right place when a plume happens to cross the sensors. And so if you only are deploying monitors like that and you have no other kind of fallback mechanism, those monitors could never trigger. And just because they never triggered over a 5-month period does not mean that no pollution events occurred. It could potentially mean that the monitors just didn't catch them. So I always say, you know, it's something that we talk about in the report that Doug mentioned. And just for those who don't know, the report was me looking at over the course of a couple of months in 2022, and then we just put out a new report based on data from last year, all of last year, me looking at facilities that are doing fence line monitoring. And these are typically facilities that are drilling or fracking or in the first 6 months of production, because that's when they're required to do it by the state. And comparing and contrasting what the monitoring showed in terms of emissions detection and what we could see with our camera in terms of emissions detection. And we, as Doug pointed out, found very little correlation between what we observed and what the monitors observed. And oftentimes, I think that was a function of, again, you know, you have a facility the size of a football field, and you have 4 tiny monitors set up at chest height, maybe in like each cardinal direction, maybe at each corner. You're just not covering a whole lot of ground that way. And there's going to be a lot of emissions that are either too high or crossing right between 2 monitors, depending on the direction of the wind. Those monitors they're just not going to see a lot of stuff. They're going to miss a lot. And so, you could improve that system right away by just adding more monitors, or you could add an additional piece of technology that could be layered on top of that. And I think oftentimes, again, and what I tried to stress with the slides that I shared is a multi kind of layered approach is probably the best approach, because no one technology is going to tell you everything you want to know about an oil and gas pad. And it's similarly, it's important to understand that if you're monitoring at the pad itself, because you want to attribute those pollutants to that specific facility, that's different than if you're monitoring in a community where you're concerned about exposure in that community to certain pollutants. And you kind of need to do both, right? You can't, we want to be able to hold them accountable for emission events that are occurring at this facility. We also want to know what is happening in communities and what communities are getting exposed to. And that's going to require different monitors. So there is no one size fits all panacea, unfortunately. I wish there was. But having redundancy and having systems that can be layered on top of each other is really important. And so if you're only relying on low cost monitors, you're not going to have a full picture, and you're going to have a very incomplete picture, in fact, of what's going on.
Okay, Laurie, because Broomfield has real experience, so you could talk about Broomfield's experience.
Sure, and we have two types of monitors we have been using. We have the, and I just want to add a little bit on to what Andrew was saying, as you're looking at these lower cost monitors and how you're actually approaching this, because you can take the low cost data sensors and you can track that sensor data, which is, that's just an indicator. But at some point in time, if it's set with the right sensitivity and the plume crosses it and you trigger the canister at the right moment, and then you can look at like what that data was showing in that relative sensor, you can actually get a pretty good idea of what was in that one canister. But it all depends on, are you monitoring because you're required to monitor and you're hoping all is well, or are you really out there trying to find where that plume is and get into that plume and capture something? So the more of those monitors you have, the greater the chance that you're going to capture it. You get a snapshot in time, which can be very powerful. But then the other type of monitoring that we have been using is the Boulder Air style monitoring, which is a continuous real-time reference grade sampling. They sample 10 minutes for us. I think it varies, but they sample 10 minutes out of every hour. So we're still not getting that 100% picture. Like, we are just not there technology wise to capture everything. So just because you didn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't there. But what we can see now is that ongoing data. They're also collecting meteorological data. So you're seeing the wind directions from where the plume is coming from. And that we had seen those images earlier where it really shows those hot spots. And we have been able to, between, having a couple of these monitors running, kind of triangulate and go, you might not say it's coming from that location, but we know it's coming from that location. And that really, puts that onus on whether it's that operator or something else happening, that you can really know that with certainty, something's coming from that location, and we know the signature, the footprint that we're seeing. So that type of data is more expensive, but it's more comprehensive. So kind of a combination of the two. Sometimes it might just be one or the other, but really getting out there and looking. And then there was a third technology that we actually used earlier in Broomfield, which was the plume tracker style data. And that's where you're collecting reference grade data for just a few hours, where you're driving around and just seeing where your source is. So I think sometimes you have to start there to see where is the concern coming from. And then you can start to put up find the monitoring locations that you believe are where you're going to collect the data that you want to, but you're never, ever going to get that full picture. So I hope that's helpful. And I'll just add on the data that we actually have been monitoring is it's a full suite of VOCs, real time, NOx, ozone, particulate matter. There's a couple other ones in there too, but you can really start to see that full picture of what you're collecting. And I guess that's pretty much, there's plenty more, but.
And one last thing I'll just add in this regard, kind of an additional layer onto all of this, and this goes to what Jody was mentioning about Larimer and Fort Collins having purchased a camera, is that, even with monitors, if you attribute the pollutant plume that you capture to this specific facility, if it's something that you want the operator to potentially fix, you still probably need to follow up with an additional piece of technology that can demonstrate where is it coming on this from on this facility? Is this a compliance issue? Is this something they need to fix? And so again, it's maybe not the most satisfying answer, but it's the honest answer, which is that it is really, really hard to monitor emissions from oil and gas. They're not going to help us unless they're forced to. And even when they're forced to, as our reports demonstrate, they're going to do the lowest cost, least effective model they can possibly do. And so in order to fill in those gaps, it does take a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of different sort of angles of looking at these plumes in order to, you know, detect the emissions, quantify the emissions, and then attribute it to a specific source and potentially hold an operator accountable for some issue that they need to fix.
I had one question. Oh, I'll let Mark speak here.
And I have to leave, so I'm sorry. Thanks.
Thank you, though, for being with us.
There we go, sit on that, yeah. So one thing I wanted to clarify, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that all of Weld County has now been added to the non-attainment area. So they're gonna also have to, yeah. And I wanted to mention two other monitoring, I don't know if you want to call them events or monitoring, that could help, at least in this area. There's, a few years ago, there was something called the FRAP-A study, where they flew some high altitude aircraft over the area to try and attribute different sources of emissions and so forth. And there's gonna be, what I've heard is that there's gonna be something like that again later this year. So that will hopefully help to track down some of the sources of some of these emissions. And also, Environmental Defense Fund with some others have launched a methane satellite that is gonna be able to measure methane at fairly high resolution around the world. And I know they're gonna concentrate on some of the methane hotspots, including Weld County. So hopefully data from that satellite will also be useful to us in trying to address the ozonation in this area.
Well, one other brief question I had relevant to the different kinds of technologies, above and beyond placement of the canisters around the site. And I'm aware that they do sometimes have a failure rate. But isn't there also a lag in the reporting from what you collect in the canisters, something like 2 weeks before it's through the lab process? So I don't know how that compares in terms of real-time monitoring, such as Boulder Air is able to deliver, but can anybody speak to that or just confirm it?
Sure, so in the, in the canister, the sensors, indicator style of monitoring where you're triggering those canisters, yes, when you see that sample that's collected, there's some basic data there, you know how much more intense that data was in that moment, how long it lasted, but to actually get that actual speciated VOC actual measurements, it's a 2 to 3 week turn in the lab, which if you're looking for some types of enforcement, just some of that knowledge of it, it's okay, like you're gonna get that data back and you're going to be able to see what's in that canister. But if I know from talking to community members and even being an impacted community member, what you're really looking for from the community perspective is that real time, I know what's happening in the moment. So it depends on what is your purpose for collecting that data. And if it's protecting the community, you really want to know immediately what you have in the air. So thank you.
You. Any other questions here?
I'm just thinking, depending on November too, any EPA regulations can be wiped.
One question.
Kind of for the doctor, but maybe everyone could answer it too. Like, so we're talking about being able to empower community members, right, with this real-time data. So what do you want people to do, or what would you suggest that people do if they see, oh, there's this huge benzene spike, or like this horrible plume is blowing over my neighborhood? Like, what can people actually do in the moment, or like how can we support our community to keep themselves safe versus like this legislative action or all of these other things that are going to take a lot more resources that people don't have. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can start. One of the biggest value adds, I think, of having monitoring in general is, and even in the instance where it's maybe like really, like purple air monitors in communities, which are very low sensitive, and they're just looking at particulate matter. But it raises awareness, right? Like one of the challenges that we have is, and even talking about the kind of what played out in the legislature, is there's a lack of, I still think, awareness, both in the Front Range and nationally, as to the actual impacts of particularly oil and gas emissions on health, on public health. I think, the climate change connection has become a little bit less of an issue in terms of us having to continue to argue that, but the awareness that, plenty of people in Colorado live very close to oil and gas facilities, especially if you live along the I-25 corridor, you may drive past oil and gas facilities all of the time. But I guarantee that the majority of people who commute past this stuff or live next to this stuff don't realize that these are facilities that potentially have an impact on air quality and potentially have an impact on health. And so one of the just general consequences plus like benefits of doing air quality monitoring of some kind and connecting community members to that air quality monitoring is raising awareness about this as an issue and making people start to see. One of my favorite things to do with the camera is to get people out with me, to expose them to this firsthand, to give them that opportunity to look through the camera and look at an oil and gas facility and start to make these connections, because otherwise it doesn't necessarily hit as viscerally as it would. And I think with air quality monitoring, at least in my perspective, is one of the benefits is to get people to start to think about this fact and to get people to realize too that if they are experiencing something like nosebleeds or smelling odors and they live near an oil and gas facility, that those two things may be connected, because especially if they're from out of state, they would just move to a neighborhood in Colorado, they may not know to make that connection unless there's some sort of information that helps them make that connection. And our efforts to kind of expand air quality monitoring into communities can help with that.
Sure, thank you. And I will add a little bit more and then pass it on down. There's so many ways that you can help make your voice heard. And sometimes as a city council member thinking with this hat on, so when we hear from the community, we actually know that these things matter. So like reaching out to your elected officials matter. And if you're looking at it from more from an environmental group, just sharing that information out there so that the public can really hear about what's going on, but don't just look at it and pass it by. Definitely share it with somebody.
Yeah, I mean, second what Andrew said, one of the big benefits of the monitoring is just to educate people, to make them aware of what's going on. If you want them to actually react to something like a benzene spike, then of course you have to try and get them, presuming it's something sporadic and not a continuous flow of benzene. You want to be able to get them that information quickly. And so if you set up a monitoring network where you had that kind of information, you could set up an alert system and so forth, where you let people know there's something going through their neighborhood and they can take, get inside or take other protective measures. So those are some ways that you can do it, but you need the monitoring first to have that information that you can use to educate the public and make them aware of what they're experiencing or could experience.
So first off, if you're thinking that if you smell something and think this is a danger to you, public health, on our website, it says dial 911. Right, to have them out there, because sometimes we do have some facilities that are doing things. If not, there's a form on the website, and it has you acknowledge and continue that it's not an emergency, that you don't need to call 911. Then it has you talk about the nature of concern, whether it's odor, noise, or lighting, things like that, and water, spill, waste, wildlife, whatever. And then what symptoms are you experiencing? Symptoms. And then talks about the additional concerns and what is the most noticeable. Is there visible smoke or emissions, possible source, and where's your exposure? And then also there's an opportunity to load up pictures and files, and then your name and contact. And just so you know, this is all quarter requestable, but it'll go in a public file. And it says it takes a few days for this to process, because again, we don't have we run very lean as a county, and so this will go through the system. So it says give up to 5 days, but also this at least documents a complaint and a date and a time of what happened, and if you have data or pictures or anything, to please add that to that file. And then also it has I would also do the same thing, contact the ECMC and make a complaint down there and do the same thing. And then also call the health department and say that you're experiencing these symptoms. And so these are all on the website, and you can find that website. And it also has you contact maybe the public health provider. But one other thing, if you feel like you've been exposed and you're experiencing some symptoms, you probably should call your health provider and go see them and have that documented, make sure you're okay, and also document that you had a health professional see your symptoms and then check you out, because I think that also is great information to have for collecting as we amass this information that we need to have, that people are being impacted. That all collectively helps with the enforcement and the work that we're trying to do. So there is some forms on our website, and there's several people to contact, and I wish it was a simpler way to do all of that. But the more documentation and a call and complain, especially if you smell something. But if you think like one that it's a long story, but in Loveland, South Loveland, they had a fire and they had a spill, right? And it's the neighbors that called because it was early one morning. And so if they hadn't called, it would have, who knows how, it was a malfunction of their new site. So that got, fire department, everyone out there, but it was someone who called immediately, because who knows how long that would have happened if no one was paying attention. So there's all those directions and things on the website, but I would not just leave it with the county. I'd also call the state and your health department and just try to get this documented as much as possible. But if you think it's an emergency, dial 911. Thanks.
Okay, folks, I hate to cut this short, but the library closes at 8. We got a late start, so we kind of let things run over a bit here, but I want to thank you all for coming out.
Thanks for doing this.
I want to thank the panel as well, because I couldn't do that. So,
And this video will be posted.
say again?
Will this video be posted somewhere?
Yeah,
We can
Yes.
share?
assuming it worked.
I think some people couldn't see.
As soon as we figure out how the technology works.
Well, I found it.